You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. A simple find turned into an all-out war. I was just a grieving father trying to fish with my daughter until our HOA president tried to humiliate us with a $500 citation. She thought I would back down. Instead, I made a bold move. Let me take you back to the day everything changed. And tell me, have you ever been fined for something completely ridiculous? The morning mist curled around the lake like a memory refusing to fade. Ayla sat beside me on the weathered dock, her small hands gripping the fishing rod with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. This was the first time she'd smiled in weeks, really smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. For a brief moment, we weren't father and daughter recovering from grief. We were simply two people catching fish and chasing silence. I had picked this community, Fairview Glades, for this lake, for this dock, for this healing. It wasn't cheap, but money was no longer the concern. After 20 years in finance, I had sold everything I built and walked away. Just months after Rachel's funeral, the cancer took her fast, and even faster. It dismantled every illusion we had about control. I couldn't bring Ayla back to life, but I could bring her somewhere still enough for her to breathe. She reeled in a bluegill, her second of the morning. "It's smaller than the last one," she said, beaming. "But faster." I nodded, about to reply, when the piece cracked. "Excuse me," came a voice like gravel in a silk bag. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I turned. A woman in her late 50s stood at the end of the dock. Blonde bob cut, designer tracksuit, a tablet clutched like a weapon. She didn't wait for a response. "This is a violation of HOA Regulation 12B. Fishing is prohibited in Fairview Lake. I'm documenting this for immediate fine issuance." "I'm sorry," I said, rising slowly. "We're new. I was told the lake was a shared amenity. It was. Until last month, the board amended usage rights for environmental concerns." Her eyes narrowed. "Didn't you read the email? I don't recall receiving one." "Not my problem." She tapped the screen. "Name Julian Westfield. My daughter and I just moved into 8 Briar Glen." Her gaze swept over our modest tackle box, the slightly worn boots I still wore from hikes with Rachel. Disdain flickered, quick and sharp. She didn't extend a hand. "Just a name. I'm Marcia Halcomb, HOA president." The words fell like a sentence. My daughter's eyes dropped. Her joy evaporated in an instant. I watched her gently lower the rod, her fingers trembling. I wanted to scream, to challenge the absurdity of it all, but I didn't. "We'll pack up," I said. As we walked back home, Ayla looked up and asked, "Why did she hate us?" "Dad," I paused. "Some people love rules more than people," I said, "but rules don't always win." I didn't know it then, but that moment was the first stone thrown in what would become the most strategic fight of my life. Not for vengeance, not even for justice, but for dignity, and I had no intention of losing. The silence at home that afternoon was louder than any argument. Ayla had gone to her room without a word, and I found myself standing at the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the lake in the distance. The same lake that was supposed to heal us. The same lake that had just reminded me how fragile peace can be when placed in the hands of petty power. I replayed the moment on the dock again and again. Not the fine, not the regulation, but Ayla's face, the light leaving her eyes like someone had shut off a switch inside her. It wasn't about fish. It wasn't even about rules. It was about being made to feel unwelcome, unworthy, in a place I paid for, in a place I chose to protect her. I booted up my laptop. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Maybe confirmation that this HOA had overstepped. Maybe a technicality. Maybe just something to make me feel like I hadn't failed my daughter. What I found instead was a rabbit hole I didn't know I was about to fall into. Marcia Halcomb, president of the Fairview Glades Homeowners Association for 9 consecutive years. Realtor, founder of Halcomb and Hartwell Realty, specializing in luxury community listings. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was the gatekeeper to this entire neighborhood's image, the enforcer, the curator of what passed for suitable here. Her fingerprints were everywhere. I found promotional videos she had posted to her firm's social media page, high-gloss clips of Fairview Lake being used for wine socials, paddleboard yoga, and catered brunches. One video even showed her laughing beside a champagne cart on the dock she fined me for standing on. Same lake, different rules. My jaw tightened. I scrolled further, checking HOA documentation, which wasn't easy to access unless you already had a login. I had to dig through archived community newsletters and cached public minutes. Finally, I found an amendment dated exactly 31 days ago, passed without a vote, citing environmental risk and liability concerns as justification to restrict lake usage. The language was vague, too vague. No environmental report was cited, no incident documented. I checked my inbox, my spam folder, every corner of my email. Nothing. No notice. No survey. No transparency. My phone buzzed. A message from Ayla. "Can I go for a walk?" I replied, yes. And as I watched her walk past the window with her headphones in, I realized something else. This wasn't just about me anymore. The HOA hadn't just taken a lake. They had taken something sacred to a grieving child, her memory, her mother's echo, her place of peace. That's when the shift happened. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to write angry letters or protest in front of the clubhouse. I had spent my entire career building companies through strategy, not noise, disruption through precision, change through leverage. That's what I knew. That's what I would use. I opened a new browser tab and typed in Fairview Glades Lake Property Ownership. The HOA didn't own the lake. Meridian Residential Development did the original developers. A footnote in a county land record showed that the HOA had leased recreational rights for 30 years starting in 1992, which meant the lease was nearing its end. I leaned back in my chair. So this wasn't about protecting wildlife. This was about positioning, control, maybe even acquisition. Marcia was cutting off access to create scarcity, and scarcity creates value. It was textbook, Real Estate 101. And I was beginning to see the outline of her play. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had the one thing she didn't: time. That night, as Ayla and I ate dinner on the patio in silence, I made a quiet promise. Not out loud, not for dramatics, just a vow between myself and the dusk. This wouldn't end with a fine. It would end with a reckoning. The next morning, I spotted him while watering the hedges, an older gentleman walking a black Labrador with the calm assurance of someone who'd lived long enough to stop pretending. Our eyes met, and he gave me a nod that was less greeting and more recognition. "You must be the one who got fined for fishing," he said, voice gravelly but kind. "Guilty," I replied, setting the hose down. "I'm Charles Brennan, 3 doors down, retired attorney, semi-retired cynic." He smiled. "And you've just met Marcia." I gave a slight laugh, but Charles didn't smile back. His face turned serious, even mournful. "She's been running this place like her own little kingdom. You're not the first casualty, and you won't be the last unless you learn how she plays the game." That was the invitation. An hour later, I sat across from him in a den filled with dusty law books and mahogany furniture that had clearly seen decades of arguments and reconciliations. The walls bore framed documents and black and white photographs, remnants of a life spent fighting battles in courtrooms, not cul-de-sacs, over a surprisingly good cup of black coffee. Charles pulled out a folder thick with clippings, meeting minutes, and scanned documents. "This is what most residents don't understand," he said, flipping through to a highlighted paragraph in a legal agreement. The lake. It was never the HOA's. It still belongs to Meridian Residential Development, the original developers. The HOA only leases usage rights, and that lease, he tapped a date, expires in 46 days. I leaned in. What happens then? Technically, Meridian can renew the lease, sell the lake to the HOA, or he paused, giving me a pointed look, sell it to anyone else. Say, an interested buyer with the means to close quickly and a reason to disrupt the status quo. I blinked, the idea forming faster than I could speak it. Are they open to selling more than open? Charles said, pouring himself another cup. Meridian's struggling, overextended on commercial properties, quietly liquidating assets to stay afloat. That was when it clicked. Marcia's sudden urgency to enforce obscure rules. Her posture of control, just as something uncontrollable approached. She wasn't consolidating power, she was stalling, trying to reshape public access before the lake changed hands. Before the illusion of her control was shattered, Charles leaned back. There's more. I've got records purchases made under shell LLCs, always after fines pile up. Owners pressured to sell below market. Guess who ends up owning those homes? He didn't have to say it. I knew. I remembered Marcia's eyes scanning me and Ayla on the dock, not with concern, but with calculation. That wasn't about a fishing pole. That was a warning. You're telling me this is a business model, I said quietly. Weaponize regulations, isolate the target, devalue the property, then swoop in through a third party to buy it up cheap. Charles nodded grimly. And now she's after the lake. The anger didn't come all at once. It settled in my chest like a slow-burning coal, because I understood what this really was. It wasn't about community values. It wasn't about property aesthetics. It was about power soft, pervasive power that hides behind bylaws and architectural committees. Power that smiled at your child while quietly erasing her place to grieve. This wasn't about fish. It was about the systems people like Marcia build unaccountable, unchallenged, and cloaked in bureaucracy. She wasn't protecting the lake. She was preparing to own it, control it, sell it off in parcels to line her own pockets while silencing anyone who dared remember what it used to mean. And I was done being silent. I walked home from Charles's house with something I hadn't felt in a long time direction. Back in my study, I began forming a plan not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. I had experience reading financials, structuring deals, finding the cracks in broken systems and widening them until the whole thing collapsed. And now I had a target, not Marcia Whitmore, the woman, but Marcia Whitmore, the idea, the structure, the culture, the pattern, the system that allowed someone like her to rise without resistance. Because the real enemy was never the lake. It was what the lake had become, a symbol of manipulated control, dressed as community stewardship. And I intended to tear that symbol down piece by piece. You never really know how many people are waiting to stand up until someone else does it first. 2 days after my conversation with Charles, I received a call from a woman named Ruth Lanning. She said she had lived in Fairview Glades for 16 years. Her voice was low, measured, and cautious, like someone who had been burned too many times. She'd heard through Charles that I was asking questions, and she had some answers of her own. We met at her home that Friday afternoon. Her backyard was a quiet oasis, overgrown in the best possible way. Lavender, mint, tomatoes climbing an old lattice. A bird feeder hung from an oak branch, drawing cardinals and blue jays. It wasn't polished, but it was alive. I used to have a full vegetable garden, she told me as she poured lemonade into mason jars, until the HOA cited me for unauthorized agricultural activity. Marcia called it a visual disruption to the aesthetic harmony of the block. She didn't sound angry anymore, just exhausted. But there was something else in her eyes too. Something simmering. Not fear, not quite hope. Maybe readiness. I didn't move here to be curated, she said. I moved here to grow things. That shouldn't be a violation. I agreed. That night, Ruth added me to a private group chat titled, fittingly, The Gladers. A handful of members, all anonymous by profile picture, just initials and guarded words. But as the hours passed, the messages multiplied. May Yuri J. Kyo Wei fined me for drying clothes on the back porch. They said it looked working class. D.W. Got a notice about the height of my grass. It's native drought tolerant, but it's not uniform. S. Sir Gee, my child was suspended from the pool for excessive laughter. Karen's grandkids were in the water at the same time. Each story like a flare in the sky, illuminating a community not peaceful, but pacified, not harmonious, but silenced. Marcia had cultivated more than rules. She had cultivated fear, but something had changed. I began organizing informal meetups under the radar coffee at odd hours, walks with Charles, porch visits under the guise of borrowing tools. I learned to look for subtle signs, a slight nod from a neighbor who once avoided eye contact, a newspaper folded twice over in a specific corner, an empty chair left out after sunset. We were learning how to communicate again. It wasn't easy. People had lived under this cloud for years. Some feared retaliation. Others had simply adapted, shrinking into silence, rationalizing it as the price of peace. But fear is a temporary leash. Eventually, the cost of silence becomes too high. One evening, Ruth invited me and Charles to a small dinner in her home. There were 6 others in attendance, all different backgrounds, professions, stories, but one thing in common: they had all crossed Marcia Whitmore in some small way, and they had all paid for it. "You know what I think about the lake," said James, a retired school teacher with a quiet voice and a spine of steel. "It's not even about the water. It's about who gets to decide who belongs near it." Heads nodded. "We can't undo what she's done," Maria said, cradling her teacup. "But we can stop what's coming." And just like that, without ceremony, without permission, a coalition was born. Charles began drafting what he called a Community Bill of Rights, a declaration to be circulated quietly, establishing principles for transparent governance, fair enforcement, and ethical land use. It wasn't official, not yet, but it was a seed. I focused on Meridian. With contacts from my old finance network, I began mapping their liquidity issues, identifying pressure points, and quietly establishing lines of communication. I needed to move fast but stay invisible. Marcia was watching. We knew that. Violation letters were increasing. Some group members received random inspections. One woman found a note on her car windshield. Some neighborhoods just aren't a fit for everyone. But the old fear was starting to crumble. Every act of intimidation now had the opposite effect. More neighbors reached out. More whispers turned into voices. The gladers grew to 24. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon, a soft knock came at my door. It was Ayla. She had tears in her eyes, but not from sadness. "Mrs. Patel, my art teacher, said something today," she whispered. "She said, she heard what you were doing. She said she used to live in Fairview Glades, and you're the first person to fight back." I crouched beside her. She said maybe it's time the neighborhood had a new kind of leader. That night, as I stood on my back porch looking out at the lake still untouched, still caught in that eerie illusion of serenity, I realized something fundamental. I wasn't leading a rebellion. I was helping a neighborhood remember its voice, and that's when Marcia Whitmore became afraid. In finance, the first rule of acquisition is never to chase what everyone sees, chase what they overlook. In Fairview Glades, everyone was watching Marcia. I was watching the lake. I had learned to live in spreadsheets, balance sheets, and market trends long before I learned to grieve. I knew how to predict failure before it broke the surface, and from everything Charles and I had uncovered, Meridian Residential Development was on the verge of drowning in its own debt. They had over-leveraged during a pre-pandemic expansion, pouring money into a mixed-use commercial project that never saw daylight. The loan-to-value ratio on their books was a warning siren. They were cash-poor, asset-heavy, and hemorrhaging investor confidence. And that lake, our lake, was one of their few remaining unencumbered assets. I didn't need to be told twice. I reached out to Thomas Brill, a friend of a friend who had once brokered municipal properties. Within a week, I was introduced quietly to a mid-level executive at Meridian, a man named Julian Tran. We met under the pretense of coffee, but within minutes we were speaking a language most people never hear, the dialect of desperation and leverage. "Ms. Whitmore has already expressed interest," he said, sipping espresso with trembling hands. We're under an exclusive negotiation period with her. Let me guess, I replied. 18-month payment structure, reliant on speculative development. He blinked. You've done your homework. I smiled, but didn't respond. The silence said enough. What are you proposing, he asked. All cash, no contingencies, 7-day closing. He stared at me like I'd just handed him a fire extinguisher in a burning house. I could almost see the internal shift, the calculation. The understanding that I wasn't here to play fair. I was here to win. I created a new entity the same evening, Westfield Land and Conservation Holdings, LLC. I paid extra to make the filing anonymous. No public association with me. No breadcrumbs leading back to the man Marcia was already targeting. She had increased her pressure, more fines, this time for trash bin placement, unauthorized planters, even a supposedly non-regulation birdhouse Ayla had made at school. It wasn't even visible from the street. The citations came with photographs. Someone had been surveilling my home, but instead of retreating, our network grew. The Gladers expanded to nearly 30 households. We had rotating meetings now, hosted in different homes. At each meeting, I quietly shared progress in coded language referring to the lake as Project Restoration, Meridian as Vendor X, and Marcia as simply the client. I needed one more angle-covered public sentiment. If I took the lake outright and shut down access, I'd be no better than Marcia. I needed a plan that wasn't just strategic, it had to be ethical, restorative, unassailable. So I began consulting with local environmentalists, water quality experts, youth education programs. I drafted a vision to restore the lake into a conservation area, offer guided ecological education for local schools, and reintroduce safe, regulated community fishing specifically for children and families. It wasn't just a counterstrike, it was a counter-narrative. Then I waited. I waited for Marcia to do what people like her always do, overcommit. And she did. A special meeting was announced, a presentation unveiled, elevating Fairview Glades. The invitation read, in it mock-ups of a lakeside clubhouse, private docks, and a members-only lounge that, conveniently, would remove public access to the areas where Ayla and I once sat. She wasn't just posturing anymore. She was moving, and that was exactly what I needed. The following morning, I called Julian Tran. The offer still stands. I told him, but the clock's ticking. 3 days later, the paperwork was ready. Meridian accepted. I wired the funds through Westfield Holdings. No public announcement, no leaks. Not even Charles or Ruth knew yet. The lake now belonged to me, and still, no one knew. I sat on my porch that evening, the deed in my hand, and stared out at the water that had started it all. I thought about Rachel. I thought about Ayla's face when the rod was ripped from her hands by regulation. I thought about how easily peace is broken when it's not protected by purpose. I didn't smile. I didn't toast. I planned, because the war wasn't won. It was just beginning. It didn't take long for Karen to sense the shift in the air. People like her can smell resistance the way sharks sense blood. It wasn't just the anonymous flyers questioning HOA policies or the quiet murmurs at the community center. It was something deeper, subtler, a change in posture, a hardening of spines. And when Karen feels power slipping, she doesn't retreat, she lunges. The special HOA meeting was held in the glimmering Lakeside Community Hall, a building that looked more like a country club than a civic resource. The room was staged like a campaign launch, fresh flowers, catered hors d'oeuvres, and a massive projector screen that read, Fairview Rising, a Vision for Tomorrow. Karen took the stage in heels that clicked like gavel strikes, her smile as polished as the wood-paneled walls behind her. She began with flattery praising the unique spirit of Fairview Glades and the importance of protecting property values from instability. Her voice was honey, her words were poison. Then came the pitch. After months of careful planning, she announced, we are proposing a bold enhancement to our lakefront, a private leisure pavilion, exclusive to long-standing residents, with wellness amenities, curated experiences, and restricted access to ensure peace and tranquility. Translation: a lakeside fortress for her inner circle. No children. No newcomers. No dissenters. She unveiled the renderings. The lounge would take up nearly a third of the shoreline. The dock where Ayla once fished gone, replaced by an elevated platform with cabanas and a wine bar. Not a single nod to the community's broader needs. This wasn't revitalization. It was exclusion, masked as improvement. Karen paused, then dropped her real move. To make this dream a reality, she said, we'll be introducing a modest special assessment, $50 a month from each household. Beginning next quarter, the funds will be used for initial development, pending a streamlined approval process through our partnership with Meridian Development. I sat in the second row, hands clasped, face unreadable. She still believed she was dealing with a man who cared about fines and conformity. She had no idea the lake was already mine. I let the meeting unfold, watched her bask in applause from the usual loyalist people who had learned it was safer to nod than to question. And then, as if following a script, Karen shifted her tone. There are, of course, certain individuals within our community who oppose progress. Individuals with unclear financial motives and a history of disruption. She never said my name. She didn't have to. Every pair of eyes in that room turned, slowly, toward me. I felt the heat of judgment, but also something else. Unease, doubt. A few faces I didn't expect to look away did just that. Then Samuel stood up. With the calm dignity of a man who had weathered worse storms, he spoke. And who exactly decides what counts as progress? Miss Whitmore. And who benefits from it? Karen's smile froze, but she wasn't done. I find it interesting, Mr. Washington, she said sweetly, that you question financial integrity, considering your own interactions with the IRS not too long ago. Gasps, whispers. Samuel didn't flinch. That issue was resolved years ago. But thank you for the reminder of who you are. The meeting ended in tension and fractured applause, but my trap was now fully set. That night, I reviewed the HOA bylaws again. Karen had claimed the assessment only needed board approval in a simple majority, but buried in subsection 9B was a requirement she had conveniently skipped for modifications affecting community-accessible property. The board required 75% homeowner consent. She didn't have it. She had built her throne on a lie, and while she congratulated herself on her grand vision, I was preparing the reveal. Earlier that day, Meridian had signed over the lake to my LLC. I held the deed in my safe. The environmental review had come back clean. All paperwork was airtight, no leaks, no delays. But the timing, that was everything. Karen's next move would be her undoing. I needed her to go all in to announce, to fundraise, to publicly stake her reputation on something she no longer had the legal right to touch. So I waited, patiently, quietly, watching her build her empire on sand. And when the moment came, I would be ready with one sentence, one piece of paper, and a microphone. This wasn't revenge. It was justice designed, financed, and engineered to detonate at the exact right time. The party was everything Karen dreamed it would be. Golden lanterns lined the walkways around Fairview Lake, casting a warm glow over the water as jazz drifted from hidden speakers. Waiters in black polos carried trays of rosé and artisan hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played near the gazebo. Residents mingled in linen and pastel, laughter echoing over the surface of the lake. It was a showcase of status, of power, of control. But it was also the end. Karen had chosen this evening, her celebration of legacy as she called it, to make a public statement. Her intention was clear: to consecrate herself as the visionary who would elevate Fairview Glades beyond a simple community and into a curated lifestyle enclave, a gated paradise, under her rule. The irony, of course, was that none of them realized they were standing on property she no longer controlled. At precisely 6:45 p.m., I arrived at the lake with Charles, Samuel, and two guests Karen hadn't expected: a real estate attorney and a uniformed police officer from the local precinct. Officer Ramirez, quiet and observant, had been briefed. He wasn't here to make arrests yet. He was here for presence, legitimacy, the subtle gravity of law. Karen spotted me instantly and began gliding across the lawn like a politician late for her podium. "You're not invited," she hissed under her breath, blocking my path. "This is a private community event." I stepped around her, calm, focused, holding a folder in one hand and a microphone in the other. "Good evening, neighbors," I said, my voice carrying over the speaker system before she could cut the power. The quartet paused. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. "I'd like to take a moment of your time to correct a misunderstanding that affects all of us. You see, the land you're currently enjoying, Fairview Lake, and the 10-foot shoreline surrounding it is no longer owned by Meridian Development, and as of 72 hours ago, it is no longer leased to the HOA either." I opened the folder and held up the deed. "It belongs to me." The silence that followed was seismic. Karen lunged toward me, eyes wide, her voice strangled with disbelief. "You're lying. This is illegal. There are contracts, recreational use agreements." I nodded. "Yes, an agreement that expires in 28 days. An agreement your board attempted to extend illegally without proper homeowner approval. An agreement which you violated repeatedly by failing to meet environmental maintenance standards." I turned to the officer. "Officer Ramirez is here to ensure an orderly departure. As of this moment, this gathering constitutes trespassing on private property." Murmurs rippled across the crowd like shock waves. People looked down at their wine glasses, at the lawn beneath their feet, as if it had betrayed them. Karen's face turned ashen. "You don't have the right to." "But I do," I interrupted, calm but firm. "Because while you were trying to turn this lake into your personal profit scheme, I was watching, listening, waiting, and then I bought the very thing you tried to weaponize against us all." The crowd wasn't angry. They were stunned, and slowly, the murmurs turned to realization, then applause. Not loud, not riotous, just enough to slice through Karen's composure, like glass through silk. Later that evening, after the guests had cleared out and the HOA board had retreated into damage control mode, I stood with Samuel and Charles at the dock where Ayla once fished. "She never saw it coming," Charles muttered, shaking his head. "She never thought she could be beaten," Samuel replied. But this wasn't about beating her. Not really. It was about reclaiming something far more sacred: dignity, autonomy, the right to exist without fear of pettiness masquerading as policy. I posted signs around the lake the next morning: private property, under restoration, community announcement to follow, and within hours my inbox filled with messages, residents asking what came next. Would they still have access? Would children be allowed to fish? Would there be rules? Yes, but they would be fair, transparent, voted on, not dictated. That night, I sat with Ayla on our porch, the lake visible in the distance under a silver moon. She leaned against me and whispered. "Did we win?" I didn't answer immediately. "We changed the rules," I said finally. "And sometimes, that's a bigger victory, because what happened that night wasn't a finale. It was the turning of the tide. You don't rebuild a community with a deed or a declaration. You rebuild it with proof." For days after the lake reveal, the neighborhood simmered with uncertainty. The HOA board went silent. Karen locked her social media accounts, and while a few of her loyalists tried to stir fear about a rogue property owner privatizing public space, most residents knew better. The tide had turned. They just weren't sure what would rise in its place. I knew better than to leave a vacuum. On the 5th day, I called for a meeting, not a HOA meeting, but a town hall. Neutral ground. No agenda, no podium, just a gathering. I invited every household. Everyone was welcome except for current board members. Not out of malice, but clarity. They'd had their platform. This one belonged to the silence. We met in the library's multi-purpose room, folding chairs, coffee and paper cups, the smell of old carpet and tension. But people showed up, nearly 70 families, standing room only. I didn't make a speech. I told a story about the first time Ayla smiled after her mother died. About a fish, a dock, and a rule used like a weapon. I spoke not as a financier or strategist, but as a father who came here hoping to heal and found instead a system designed to exclude. I explained, plainly, that I had purchased the lake not to take power, but to dismantle it, to return what had been held hostage by manipulation and abuse. And then I offered a proposal. I would not keep the lake. I would donate it to the residents through a newly formed community trust. It would be governed not by the HOA, but by an independent committee, with rotating membership, term limits, and open books. 3 conditions. First, the HOA must be restructured, term limits for all board positions, transparent elections, recall procedures. Second, every rule in the HOA handbook would be reviewed and voted on one by one. No more backdoor amendments, no more selective enforcement. Third, an independent ethics committee, elected annually, with no overlap with the board, empowered to investigate all complaints and enforce accountability. For the first time in years, people began to breathe. Then I dropped the final card, one I hadn't shared even with Charles or Samuel. Over the past month, I'd quietly purchased the mortgage notes on nearly 20 properties in Fairview Glades, all held by the local community bank. Many of them belonged to families who had been targeted by Karen's regime. And one of them, perhaps most poetically, was Karen Whitmore's. Gasps filled the room. I have no interest in foreclosure, I said calmly. In fact, I intend to offer refinancing options at below market rates to every homeowner once the HOA is rebuilt with integrity. It was leverage, yes, but not for punishment, for protection, for negotiation, a safeguard against another Karen. A vote was held that night, not formal, not binding, but symbolic. The results were overwhelming, 91% in favor of dissolving the current board and implementing the proposed reforms. The next day, 3 board members resigned. By the end of the week, Karen submitted her resignation for personal reasons. No farewell email, no statement, just silence. I officially signed the deed transfer to the newly formed Fairview Lake Trust, stipulating its use for community benefit in perpetuity. No resale, no development. Any attempt to do so would trigger automatic reversion to the trust. We renamed the lake Rachel's Lake, in honor of the woman who had once sat on a dock, smiling at the world through the eyes of our daughter. It wasn't just poetic, it was personal. The reform spread, neighboring communities reached out, news stories were written. Our model, born from resistance, became a blueprint. But more importantly, Fairview changed. The fences between people, invisible and real, began to come down. Yards that once competed now collaborated, shared garden beds. Children riding bikes together again. The fishing dock was rebuilt, wider and safer. Ayla helped to design a junior conservation program where kids could learn about ecology, wildlife, and community stewardship. And yes, there were still rules, but now they were written together. One sunny Saturday, as parents watched their kids fish at Rachel's Lake, someone tapped my shoulder. It was Veronica Palmer. She had once scoffed at me during an HOA meeting, called me entitled. Now she stood awkwardly, clutching a clipboard. My son really wants to join the lake program. She said, I've reconsidered my position on the board. I smiled, not triumphantly, just tiredly. I think that's wise. She nodded, and the clipboard slipped just a little in her hand. Sometimes change begins with confrontation. Sometimes it begins when people realize the story they were told wasn't the truth. But real change, it begins when people stop being afraid of each other. Power doesn't collapse all at once. It fractures, quietly, internally, like an old wall straining under pressure. The first signs are always dismissed as cosmetic until one day, everything caves in. Karen didn't disappear after her resignation. She simply retreated, licking her wounds behind drawn curtains, crafting a new narrative. According to her closest allies, she had been unfairly ousted by a smear campaign orchestrated by an outsider who didn't respect community tradition. But no amount of whispered spin could disguise the truth anymore. Because truth, once seen, is irreversible. It started with Sapphira Duskland. She had been one of Karen's longest-standing board supporters, a florist with deep community roots. Known for her soft voice and even softer backbone, for years, she had voted in favor of every policy Karen pushed. Whether she agreed with it or not, safety and silence. Self-preservation disguised as diplomacy, until the lake. Until she found herself staring at a lakeside pavilion rendering with her flower shop's name misspelled, and realized she had never actually been consulted about the project she was expected to champion. Her breaking point came at the next HOA meeting, now hosted in the community center, open to all, under interim leadership. Sapphira stood up slowly, clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her voice trembled, but it didn't falter. "I've been on this board for 3 years," she began, eyes scanning a room filled with both familiar and cautious faces. "And I've watched decisions being made behind closed doors, rules rewritten to target individuals, and funds allocated without transparency." She swallowed. "I was told to stay quiet, that speaking up would cause trouble, that it would hurt my business. But I've realized something. Silence doesn't protect anyone. It just deepens the damage." Then she opened the folder. Inside were budget breakdowns, project approvals, and email threads records she had quietly compiled. They painted a damning picture: $80,000 spent to renovate a park that serviced just a handful of homes, all of which belonged to Karen's inner circle. Meanwhile, the main community park had been denied funding for basic repairs 3 years in a row. Gasps filled the room. Some of them were from people who had voted for those denials. The room shifted. Something cracked. And through that crack, more truth poured in. James Morris, the retired teacher, stood and described how he had received violation letters for holiday lights that hadn't changed in 15 years. Letters that came conveniently the day after he spoke against HOA decisions at a council meeting. Maria Gonzalez tearfully recounted the afternoon her foster children were banned from the pool because Karen's grandchildren needed quiet, and how no written rule could ever be produced to justify it. One by one, the stories emerged. Not new injustices, but long-buried ones. The kind people keep to themselves out of shame, or fear, or resignation. Until now. The meeting ended with a motion to audit the HOA's finances for the past 5 years. The vote was unanimous. Even those who had once nodded along with Karen did not raise their hands to oppose it. Not this time. Outside, after the meeting, I found Sapphira standing alone beneath the pergola, staring at the lake. "You were brave in there," I said. She gave a half laugh. "I was late, but not too late." "No," I replied. "You were right on time." That same week, a quiet flurry of resignations swept through Karen's former inner circle. Board members stepped down citing health reasons, professional obligations, family matters. The reasons didn't matter. The pattern did, and behind the scenes, the audit began. Samuel, with his background in banking, offered to assist the independent committee. He brought with him a former IRS compliance officer who volunteered to help, unpaid. Ruth offered her garage as the staging space, paperwork stacked in crates, spreadsheets printed, receipts matched with reports. It was slow, meticulous work, but it was deadly. Within a month, early findings showed irregularities: missing receipts, inflated vendor payments, duplicated charges, and more troubling, multiple transactions linked to companies tied to Wellington Realty, including payments for consultation services that no one could explain. Karen's kingdom was crumbling, and not just morally, legally. Then came the final blow. Merrick Henderson, who had kept to the shadows for most of the fallout, Knocked on my door with a flash drive and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She tried to buy me, he said simply. Karen had approached him with an offer, clear all his past violations, grant him a new seat on a restructured board, and provide a small stipend if he could convince me to sell the lake back to the HOA. She said I should scare you. Talk about insurance liabilities, environmental concerns. Make it sound risky. He played me the recording. Her voice was crystal clear. I can make all this go away. Merrick, you and I both know rules are just leverage. Let's use them, not fight them. I leaned back and closed my eyes. She didn't understand. She never had. You can bully a neighbor. You can manipulate a system. But once people stop being afraid, you can't do a damn thing to stop the truth. Karen Whitmore's fall didn't come with sirens or flashing lights. It came with silence, slow, suffocating, irreversible. The day she was charged, it was a neighbor who tipped me off, one of the same faces that used to sit beside her at HOA meetings, applauding every policy with a glass of Sauvignon Blanc in hand. Now, they whispered her name like a ghost's. The footage Merrick handed over to the police, showing Karen pouring an unidentified substance into Rachel's lake in the dead of night, had been damning. But it wasn't just the act. It was the intention. She hadn't just trespassed. She had tried to fabricate pollution to reclaim what she'd lost. She was prepared to poison the symbol of her defeat: criminal trespassing, attempted environmental contamination. Investigators followed the trail deeper: misuse of HOA funds, selective enforcement. A dozen homeowners joined in civil lawsuits, backed by evidence unearthed during the audit. Karen's carefully constructed empire of intimidation, silence, and control unraveled thread by thread. By summer's end, she had lost her real estate license, declared bankruptcy, and quietly listed her home. No buyers came, no offers made. The for sale sign stood like a gravestone to a reign that once ruled unchecked. Justice had come not with vengeance, but with structure. Fairview Glades changed. The reformed HOA bylaws passed with overwhelming support. Term limits, financial transparency, ethics oversight, it all became real. No more secret votes, no more whispered threats, just governance finally accountable to those it claimed to serve. In Rachel's lake, our lake flourished. The restoration program Ayla and I had begun expanded into a full environmental education initiative. Kids planted wildflowers along the shoreline. Residents volunteered for cleanup days. Evenings were filled with the gentle sounds of casting lines and laughter. The dock was rebuilt by a group of fathers and sons. The same one Karen once wanted removed now stood firmer than ever. And on one particular afternoon, exactly 1 year from the day I first received that $500 fine, Ayla and I sat on the edge of the dock with our shoes off, the water rippling beneath our toes. Around us, families picnicked, kids ran with nets, chasing frogs. The air smelled of cut grass and charcoal. It was the sound of a community breathing again. Ayla leaned into me. "It feels different now," she said softly. "It is different," I replied. "We built this." She looked out across the lake, eyes thoughtful. "Do you think she regrets it?" I considered it. Maybe, maybe not. But regret isn't ours to manage. We don't need her to be sorry. We needed her to stop. We sat for a while longer, watching the sun stretch across the surface of the lake like a promise. I never sought to become a leader. I never wanted to wage war against a neighborhood bureaucracy. But sometimes life hands you the weight of a fight simply because no one else will lift it. And when you do, when you stand firm, think smart, and wait for your moment. Sometimes you win. Not loudly, but completely. Rachel's Lake stands as a quiet monument now, not to revenge, but to resilience. Not to victory, but to restoration. Sometimes the best revenge is restoring what they tried to steal. And if you've made it this far, tell me, was I too harsh or did they deserve it? I'd love to hear your take.